you want us to use it for you?
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the Wilson Center and to today's meeting on McCain, Obama and the Middle East, the influence of domestic politics on U.S. policy. I'm Hala, the director of the Middle East program at the center. The Wilson Center is the living memorial to President Wilson, established by Congress in 1968. The center is a nonpartisan institution engaged in the study of national and world affairs. The center maintains a neutral forum for free, open, and informed dialogue and provides a link between the world of ideas and policy. Today's meeting is moderated by my colleague Aaron David Miller, the author of America and the Much Too Promised Land, The Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace, published earlier this year. Aaron is currently a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center. He has served as advisor on the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli peace process to 6 secretaries of state. He was also the president of Seeds for Peace, a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering young leaders in the region. We are pleased to have all of you here today, and we hope that the next time you visit us at the center, you will visit the exhibition for President Wilson on the ground floor. I would like to acknowledge the presence of the chairman of the board of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Joe Gildenhorn, who has been a strong supporter of the Middle East program. Can I please remind you or ask you to turn off your cell phones and your Blackberries because it interferes with the live webcast we have. Aaron, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hala, thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. Of all the aspects related to Arab-Israeli peacemaking, I suspect the most emotionally charged and least understood is how domestic politics interacts with the formation of our Middle East policy, particularly on matters concerning Israel and the pursuit of Arab-Israeli peace. The fact is that the title of our panel is somewhat misleading. It's not, the question is not, will domestic politics influence the policies toward the Middle East of President Obama or McCain, but to what extent and how? Because the reality is, in this political system, for better or for worse, with all of its perfections and imperfections, a sustainable foreign policy requires, in a democracy, a sustainable domestic political consensus, whether that policy runs in the right or wrong direction. And the consensus is forged as a consequence of the interaction of various forces within our society: Congress, the media, the interaction of the president, and domestic lobbies. This competition is inevitable. Some people argue it's a reality, some people argue it's a necessary evil, but the fact is it exists. I wouldn't argue it's a necessary evil so much as a reality. I would no more want the Middle East specialists at the Department of State forging and forming American foreign policy than I would members of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. Tony Lake once said to me that domestic politics is like sex to the Victorians. Nobody talks about it, but it's on everybody's mind. And it seems to me we need to start talking about it. The stakes for America are extremely high, but we have to talk about it with some measure of clarity, some measure of honesty, a certain soberness, free from as many emotions and conspiracies that we can imagine. And that's really the purpose of this panel today. We brought together 3 individuals and myself who will share their observations on this critically important subject. All, I believe, know Washington well. All have participated formally or informally in Washington politics, some serving in government or in Congress. And I truly believe, or I wouldn't have invited them, all are honest observers of the Washington scene. You have their bios in front of you. Each will offer no more than 15 minutes of comment, followed by some additional comments by me, and then we will have questions from you, and I suspect a very lively discussion. I'm going to ask Hussein Ibish to begin.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for coming out. I'm going to begin, and I'm going to speak maybe a little more broadly in some ways about this question, because I'm not going to confine myself exclusively to the question of Israel and Palestine, particularly in the beginning, but I'll come back to the Israeli-Palestinian situation more towards the end. I agree. I mean, there's no question that domestic politics influence foreign policy. In the end, domestic politics is, probably drives almost any policy you like. However, it's often very difficult for the levers of domestic politics to make themselves felt in foreign policy. And that's not necessarily true at all in the Israeli-Palestinian context, as I'll come to. But when you look at other American foreign policy decisions and long-standing policy commitments in the Middle East, the relationship between domestic politics and those stances is a little bit more attenuated. Congress is much closer than the executive branch to public opinion, and Congress's influence is obviously attenuated because it's limited to the rhetorical, the consent function, and also, of course, the financial levers, the purse strings, which again are difficult to use in many cases, and sometimes presidents have been creative in finding ways of getting around it, as in the Iran-Contra affair, for example. Now, I just wanted to begin by pointing out how difficult it is for public opinion to make itself felt, but the strong connection that it can have with foreign policy in the Middle East before getting to the Israel-Palestine question. I would point, for example, to the great shaking of the foundations that started to threaten to occur in the United States with regard to the longstanding U.S.-Saudi relationship in the period following the September 11, 2001 attacks. It wasn't a direct response to the 9/11 attacks, and really didn't start occurring until 2002. And as you didn't see this playing itself out in the public discourse or in public opinion until sometime into 2002 in any meaningful way. But the fact is that between 2002 and the middle to late 2003, a public discourse, a discourse in the media that started to have considerable impact on public perceptions of the nature of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, the nature of the relationship of the Saudi government with the September 11th attacks. In other words, the notion that the Saudi government was somehow responsible, either directly or indirectly, knowingly or unknowingly, for the September 11 attacks, really did threaten to force the government here to re-examine the U.S.-Saudi relationship. You had an increasing sort of intensity of questions regarding Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia, friend or foe, is how it was usually framed in the media, and a succession of hardline commentators that raised that question in a very tendentious manner, heavily weighted towards the second conclusion. In other words, that it was a self-answering question. The answer was always foe. And I think it's noteworthy that the policy survived, the relationship survived, and public opinion in that case didn't manage to shift it. This was partly because it was a ludicrous case in the first place. I mean, to accept that, you'd have to believe that the Saudis had launched a campaign to overthrow themselves, completely absurd. Plus, when Al-Qaeda forces inside Saudi Arabia started attacking oil infrastructure and other national assets of Saudi Arabia, the whole thing became patently absurd, and it sort of withered away, and the relationship survived. But I do think that's a good example of how public opinion could begin to be a factor in affecting U.S. policy in the Middle East, in this case in a negative and irrational way, but it didn't work. Maybe another example of how that can happen emerged, and it's also sort of irrational post 9/11 hysteria about the so-called the quote reliability close quote of crucial Arab allies to the United States was to be seen in 2006 in the Dubai Port World scandal, when there was a sale of P&O North America as part of a larger package of takeover of P&O by Dubai Port World, and leases for operating, for managing several key American ports were going to be transferred, not in any meaningful way, but just the ultimate owners would now be in Dubai rather than in London. It became, in the minds of quite a few people in this country, a lot of commentators, several members of Congress, and interestingly, a lot of Democrats, which shows that I think people on the left side of the spectrum, and liberals as well as the Republicans, can engage in this kind of demagoguery, started casting this as a national security issue about the reliability of Dubai, the reliability of, and all these implications about terrorism, et cetera, and even more sort of irrational and unfounded. And in that case, actually, really, the sale went through and the criticism died down only when Dubai Port World announced that it was going to sell the leases that P&O North America had. So, in other words, basically voluntarily gave up that part of the deal. But again, this sort of intensification of public opinion, whether rational or irrational, in this case extremely irrational, can begin to shake the foundations of long-standing commitments. Again, in this case, it was diffused, but I don't think the administration did a very good job, frankly, and its supporters did a very good job of fending off this sort of wave of hostility, and really it was Dubai Port World and its allies in the UAE government that had to diffuse that situation. Obviously, the situation in Iraq is another one, which you can see a very strong interplay between U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and domestic politics. In this case, maybe more strongly in reverse. In other words, with international developments starting to affect domestic politics in the United States, the degree to which the war became a controversial issue and unpopular phenomenon in the United States, you could argue, has strongly influenced the shape of U.S. domestic politics. In other words, if you look at the present presidential campaign, I think you could argue that without things being perceived very strongly as going very badly in Iraq for the past few years, and the war becoming extremely unpopular, it's entirely possible the Republicans might have nominated a different candidate, and that the Democrats might have nominated a different candidate, and that you'd see two different people running for this office, and that the relative strength of Democrats and Republicans in this election might be very, very different. I'm not saying Iraq is the only issue that drives this, but clearly you're looking at two candidates who were very much in the thick of the Iraq debate in their own party, and obviously a big role in the primaries. It's an issue now, clearly. So to bring this closer to the question that Dr. Miller sets up, which is, will domestic politics influence McCain, Obama, U.S. policy? I mean, of course it will. Of course it's going to have an influence. And actually, international affairs will influence domestic politics as well, as I've tried to show in these sort of two sets of examples. But I do think there's a strong limitation on how much influence domestic politics can have. I mean, first of all, I note the difficulty that domestic politics has in making itself felt in long-standing consensus foreign policy commitments. It's true, I think, though, that where you have a situation where there's either a very powerful interest which doesn't represent an identity or voting constituency, and not a kind of identity group constituency, such as defense contractors, or if you were to look at, for example, healthcare issues, the pharmaceutical lobby, the HMO lobbies, et cetera, and nothing on the other side, it doesn't take that much contained strength to make your point clear. In other words, well, I mean, you look at debates on healthcare, and you can see the difference between these corporate lobbies and the absence of such a thing as a sick person's lobby in shaping the way the healthcare system has been managed. It's pretty clear who wins out there. And certainly when you look at questions of Israel and Palestine, or Israel and its neighbors, there's no doubt that the strength and power of the pro-Israel lobby on the one side, with nothing else on the other side, the failure of the supporters of Palestine to create anything remotely similar, any vehicle for any kind of serious influence, particularly on the Hill, has been a crucial factor in helping to define the way U.S. policy has gone. But I think that basic argument really is over. And I do agree with those who say, look, the special relationship has been crafted. It's a done deal. It would certainly be a generational shift and a glacial long-term shift to seek to alter that. And I think that people who want to end the occupation and have two states living side by side in peace and security actually don't have to do that. It's not our task to try to break the special relationship the United States has with Israel. Rather, it's a task to say, listen, look, ending the occupation and having an end of conflict agreement, which results in Israel and Palestine living side by side together, is actually in the American national interest. Moreover, it's in the Israeli interest and Israel's national interest. Moreover, it's the only object that makes sense for the Palestinian national movement. And it's good for the Arabs and good for the Europeans and good for the world. So, in other words, this traditional way of looking at domestic politics, in which you have a non-existent but plausible potential Arab/Muslim lobby on the one hand, or anyone who might want to oppose the U.S. relationship with Israel on the one hand, in a zero-sum relationship with the pro-Israel lobby on the other hand, is wrong when it comes to ending the conflict in the Middle East. It's wrong when it comes to the interests of Palestinians and the interests of the Friends of Palestine, because like it or not, what the Israelis and the Palestinians need is the same thing, an end of conflict agreement and two states living side by side in peace. It's also what the United States needs. Now, what's interesting about this, I'll wrap up with this. I think I might be, yeah. All right. Well, at any rate, what's interesting about this is that U.S. public opinion, according to my reading of the polls, actually has been in a good place for a long time. For many, many years, at least 10 years now. The overwhelming sentiment of the American public has been to blame both parties for this conflict. Yes, Americans are, broadly speaking, more well-disposed towards Israel. They're more well-disposed towards Israelis, etc. But still, when you ask them specific questions, poll after poll that I've looked at, you get these consistent answers, that they blame both sides for the conflict, that they want the U.S. government to pressure both sides to come to a reasonable accommodation for peace, and that they overwhelmingly support the idea of two states living side by side in peace. That last part dovetailing rather nicely with solid majorities in favor of that among Israelis and Palestinians as well. So it strikes me that actually, as we've moved over the past 10 or 15 years closer and closer to an explicit commitment in favor of, not only rhetorically in favor of a two-state solution, but actually shifting policy into a position where it starts to work practically in that direction, that what you've seen is U.S. policy coming more and more into line with U.S. public opinion and with a certain strand of pressure in U.S. domestic politics. Now, that, I think, has happened partly in spite of and partly because of the goals and desires of some pro-Israel lobbies. In fact, the pro-Israel community has been split on this issue for a long time, and it remains split. It's not unified in favor of one thing or the other. And I think that if this policy shift had been uniformly opposed by the pro-Israel lobby, it wouldn't have happened. But you can clearly see it being criticized by some serious and influential people in that community. And I'm not only talking about the evangelical Christian right that believes that General Sharon was put into a coma by God because of the redeployment in Gaza. What that means, by the way, what all of this means is that you've got a very powerful weapon in domestic politics that hasn't been exercised yet. That is this overwhelming, consistent public opinion in favor of two states and an end of conflict agreement. That is potentially a weapon and a tool that could be used by a determined president that wanted to marshal through a two-state agreement, in the face of significant opposition from isolated pockets of strong resistance, whether it's in the evangelical Christian right or parts of the pro-Israel Jewish community or from certain Arab Americans or American Muslims or whoever it's from. In other words, you've got a powerful tool, potentially, that a determined, committed president could use in marshaling our policy towards its realization, and that could be used to help reconcile politics and policy, which right now are, in a certain extent, in conflict, and to get us all to where we need to go. So that's, I think, where I'll end, and I'll let the others pick it up and flesh out the details, because I've spoken very broadly. Thanks.
Thanks, Hussein. Richard?
Yeah. It's generally, in my view, correctly believed that the influence of the pro-Israel groups, and for purposes of my discussion, I'm going to be focusing on the American Jewish community, rests on their active and successful participation in the political process. And it's true that while general voter turnout, even in presidential election years, is about 50%, the Jewish community often votes at around 90%. Even more striking is the relatively new phenomenon of Jews running for elective office. While comprising only about 2% of the American population, they make up 5% of the members of the U.S. House of Representatives, and even more astoundingly, 13 out of 100 senators, including 2 senators from, of all places, the state of Wisconsin. What you have here is fundraising. Few would doubt also that the Jewish community raises a lot of money for political candidates, Democrats as well as Republicans. I haven't seen the stats on this, but I think it's a fair guess to say that it comprises a double-digit multiple of the same 2% we're talking about, and again, for both Republicans and Democrats. But I would argue that even more important than this participation and this influence is the exaggerated perception of the influence. Years ago, I worked with someone who had done when he was in graduate school, a master's paper on congressional attitudes towards the Jewish community. And he managed to interview 150 members of the House of Representatives and asked them a number of questions, one of which was, how many Jews are there in your congressional district? And he found, and the results were that the incumbent congressmen get elected at about re-elected at about 90%. They know their constituencies. Nevertheless, they overestimated the Jewish population by 4 to 12 times the number of people there actually had. One of the congressmen was a man named Tim Wirth, who later became a senator congressman from Colorado, later became senator and undersecretary of state. And when told after these results that he had only 2,500 Jews in his district, he said he found that inconceivable. He knew 2,500 Jews in his district. Now, why is this? I think it's because the Jewish community by nature is quite activist. And this goes for not just politics, but across the board, including philanthropy. Jews are boisterously involved in these various activities. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to take 50 Jewish leaders or Jewish individuals around the Capitol. And the centerpiece of this visit was lunch in the Capitol. And the speaker at lunch was the then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Now, these 50 individuals were contributors to an education of higher learning in Israel. And it wasn't very difficult, actually. I mean, Speaker Gingrich was a busy man. It's just 50 individuals. But it wasn't very difficult to convince his chief of staff that he should speak to this group, because in order to be eligible to come to Washington for this tour that included lunch, each of these individuals had to have given $1 million to the Institution of Higher Learning in Israel. Yet I don't have any reason to believe that this group returned any great favors to Speaker Gingrich. He spoke to them about philanthropy and being in the American tradition, and I don't think they increased their giving to Republican candidates. In fact, they were a fairly apolitical group. And even the Jewish community, I think, can fall victim to its own misperceptions about itself and its influence, such as, for example, that the Jewish vote is up for grabs. It's up for grabs, certainly, if the candidates are both considerably left of center. I first saw this in 1978 on the Democratic primary in New York. The two contending candidates, one was Representative Bella Abzug, a very left-wing Democratic congresswoman, Jewish, and she ran against Daniel Patrick Moynihan, left of center, liberal Democrat, non-Jewish, but had made his reputation at the United Nations as the ambassador who spoke very strongly in favor of Israel. Now, there you would have, in what the Jewish world, or the American Jewish world, would be a centrist in Moynihan and a left-wing liberal in Abzug. And understandably, they split the vote, 50-50. So it's left and right, but considerably left of center. But yet 2 years later, there was a very different story in the Democratic primary in New York. Now, there it wasn't for the Senate, it was for the presidency. And you had a moderate to liberal candidate against a liberal left candidate. The moderate to the left of center moderate was the president, incumbent President Jimmy Carter. To his left was the challenger, Senator Edward Kennedy. And the polls going up to it, and New York's a good example because there's a large enough Jewish population that you can actually do some good, run some good numbers on it. The polls showed until very near the end of the primary campaign, they were running about 50-50 in the Jewish community. But then on the eve of the primary vote, President sent his ambassador to the United Nations, Andy Young, to cast a vote. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was certainly perceived as being anti-Israel. And overnight, the shift came, and Ted Kennedy won 90% of the Jewish vote, won the New York primary going away, extended his campaign all the way to the convention. And it didn't stop there. In the general election, Jimmy Carter became the first Democratic nominee in decades, and certainly no Democratic nominee since, to receive less than 50% of the Jewish vote. And he did that running against, a right-wing Republican in Ronald Reagan. There was an independent candidate, John Anderson, who helped siphon away some of the votes, but Jimmy Carter got less than 50 votes. So we can establish that under certain circumstances, the Jewish community can actually make a difference. But then, even then, how important is it? We can go all the way back to 1948 and say that in 1948, President Truman, advised by his political advisors, Clark Clifford and others, and against the wishes of his very strong and highly respected Secretary of State, George Marshall, nevertheless recognized Israel within a few minutes of Israel's Declaration of Independence, and did it for political reasons. But I'm not going to go back. I'm going to only go back so far. And for me, I think the place to go back to is the Yom Kippur War, because it's then that we're dealing, I would think, in the modern era, the era that we're talking about now. And it's also the beginning of an era, it is the beginning of an era of massive American assistance to Israel. And what you found there is that the Jewish community learned that they could lose in a day on the floor of the House or the Senate as much money as the organized Jewish committee, United Jewish Appeal or whatever, could raise in a year. They could lose or gain as much money for Israel in one floor vote. I went to work for AIPAC in 1977, and in those days, AIPAC, a much smaller organization than it is today, operated under a very simple principle that was enunciated by its founder, Cy Kennan. And that principle was that an AIPAC member, his job was to get in touch with his congressman to tell the president to overrule the State Department. And that motto made a lot of sense until 1973 and 74, when it was the Secretary of State, Kissinger, and the president who were the ones proposing billions of dollars of aid to Israel. It's impossible to imagine then, or even now, Congress proposing billions of dollars of aid to Israel. But instead, what happens is that Congress approves an administration request for aid to Israel. Moreover, it's very difficult, not difficult to imagine, actually I can have experienced, it's very difficult to fight a determined administration when it wants to do something and Congress or the American Jewish community urges Congress not to do it. I saw that working at AIPAC when there were a number of arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and the American Jewish community urged Congress to oppose them. The administration easily overwhelmed AIPAC. But like with the Yom Kippur War, changing the relationship in terms of American aid to Israel, so too events later on changed other aspects of the relationship. And here I'm referring to the watershed year of 1980. Ronald Reagan was elected against the backdrop of the United States being humiliated at the hands of Middle East radicals. And these were the kind of radicals that the Israelis have been battling for years. So the Reagan administration saw in Israel an ally. And if you look at the Iran-Contra affair, perhaps even a role model for how it should be behaving with our radicals in the Middle East. Ironically, the man I think you saw implement it most was a man who had been the chief executive officer of the Bechtel Corporation, which had done billions of dollars worth of business in the Middle East, had firsthand knowledge with Middle East leaders, and that man was Ronald Reagan's second Secretary of State, George Shultz. George Shultz came into office very much concerned with the Palestinian issue, very much interested in working with the Arab world, but in a very short period of time became, in the view of many State Department officials, Israel's desk officer. He's a trained economist, former Secretary of the Treasury. Israel was having all sorts of difficulty with hyperinflation, and Shultz worked that issue and indeed was crucial in Israel receiving more than $1 billion in additional assistance. He also became disillusioned dealing with the Saudis on a political level instead of a business level, the Saudis in particular. And again, in the view of State Department officials that I knew, he became the first American Secretary of State to become pro-Israel and somewhat anti-Arab in office instead of the other way around. By 1988, I think the Arabs, many Arabs, and particularly the PLO, saw that the road to Jerusalem no longer went through Washington, but instead, perhaps the road to Washington had to go through Jerusalem. And then you had the election of two, what I would call, throwbacks, George Herbert Walker Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker. Now, they were very busy. The Cold War was ending. The Soviet Union was collapsing. There was a Gulf War coalition to organize. And we could ask, did time run out on them? Would they, as some say, have gotten around to forcing through changes in the teeth of domestic opposition, but more importantly, in my view, 8 or even 18 years of policy moving in the other direction, and tried something dramatic in Bush's second term, perhaps. But they never got the chance. And it wasn't the Jewish community, but the economy, or as they said, the economy is stupid, that elected Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, who seemed to have a limitless amount of empathy for one and all, Bill Clinton, who worked tirelessly on behalf of Arab-Israeli affairs, but it was Bill Clinton, in the words of our distinguished moderator, who became Israel's lawyer. And it was Bill Clinton, not the Jewish community, who most effectively laid blame for the failure at Camp David in 2000 at the feet of the Palestinians. Now, if Clinton was Israel's lawyer, his successor took on the additional roles of judge and jury. After 9/11, George W. Bush took an even more Manichaean view of the world than his political godfather, Ronald Reagan. In this world of black and white, good and evil, the Israelis, not the Arabs, and certainly not the Palestinians, wore white hats. So where does this leave domestic politics? In my humble opinion, I submit very much in the shadow of a political world dominated by the views of key executive branch officials. The president, on occasion, a powerful vice president, the Secretary of State, and perhaps a few others. But these officials understand and reflect the views of the public at large, and those views are shaped by events far more powerful than anything that a domestic constituency can mount an attack against.
Thank you. Graeme?
It's always difficult to be the third person when you don't know what the previous two people are going to say, because a lot of your ideas are taken up by them. But let me say I feel fortunate to be here on a panel with Aaron, who we worked together in the State Department in the 1970s, with Richard, who was conspired to talk me into leaving my nice job at the State Department to go work in the Hill so I could get fired 3 times in 8 years, and Hussein, whose parents were good friends of mine at the American University of Beirut when he was just a youngster. So, but anyhow, let me say there is no question that domestic politics will influence the policy of either the Obama or McCain administrations. It'll happen. It's the way it should be. It's the way our country works. Our government is supposed to respond to what the people want. That is how a republic works. That is how our government is set up. Anybody who's ever worked in government knows that the public opinion has an important impact upon what the decisions of that government. I can tell you, I worked for a senator who one year received 13 million letters and postcards. But still, it's a lot of postcards and letters. My wife volunteers 1 day a week now at the White House doing nothing but reading and sorting mail to make sure that the president knows what the people are saying to him. Domestic opinion matters in our country. That's why we're a democracy. Right from the beginning, the way our system is set up, it allows people to influence the government. One of the great things about Washington, to be honest, I mean, I still to this day, as an old person that I am today, am enthusiastic about Washington because even people like me can have some influence on the policy of my country. Where else in the world can you have that happen? That's the way our system works. Now the question when it comes to the Middle East that everybody here has been dancing around is, what about the lobbies? What about the influence of the lobby in the United States? What about the influence of domestic lobbies that support a relationship with a foreign country? That's not a traditional lobby. That is not something that's happened for a long time. It has changed and become much more common in the last 30 years. When I went to Capitol Hill as a staffer in 1979 from the State Department, I can tell you there were 3 foreign entities that had a regular lobby that I would see. AIPAC, for the pro-Israeli lobby. The Greeks would be there mainly to be anti-Turkish. And the Armenians were there supporting the Greeks in that endeavor. That was all you ever saw. Today, when you go to Capitol Hill, there are all sorts of domestic ethnic groups who are lobbying Capitol Hill. The most amazing transformation, it took a long, we didn't have domestic lobbies who lobbied on ethnic issues before the 1970s in any large extent. I don't know why. It just changed. It just absolutely changed in our time. The most reasons is people who came to this country, who emigrated from overseas, did not want to be identified with the country they came from or some relationship. They wanted to be real Americans. And so the last thing they wanted to do was to do that. But 2 generations into it, 3 generations into it, people began to think, gee, there is a relationship there. We need a good relationship. It's in the national interest of the United States. And I think that became, and Richard, I think you were right on the cutting edge of pushing the ideas that this is the national interest of the United States. But that has grown over the years and has changed and transformed the relationship. Richard touched upon the strengths and the reasons why people pay attention to the lobbies. But of all the foreign lobbies, the lobby that people pay most attention to is AIPAC, is the pro-Israeli lobby. Any ethnic group in this country, be you Filipino or Azerbaijani or whatever, says, we want to be like those guys. They're going to be our model because they are on any list of lobbies. It is the only lobby representing somebody who wants to promote the bilateral relationship with another country that makes the list of the top 10 most influential lobbies. They're right up there with the NRA and AARP. That's the extent of their influence. And people on Capitol Hill and in the administration pay attention to what they say. Now, should they? Absolutely. They represent American interest in the Middle East. The strength of the lobby, I would argue, has become greater over the years. Why? Well, they're efficient, they're good, they raise money, they're very competent, they're committed. That's all very positive things. If you're on the receiving end of being opposed to them, it's not pleasant. And it is and there is a reputation that they developed, as Richard said. More than real is the reputation. And a reputation, I would argue, for political people was made in the early 1980s. And it was actually made by people who lost and then claimed they lost because of the lobby. The first was Congressman Findley. He lost his election in central Illinois and then went out and said, the reason I lost is because of my position on the Middle East. The second person to lose was Senator Percy, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He went out and said, I lost because the lobby turned against me. Did the lobby turn against them? Yes. Was that the reason they lost? No. They lost because they lost contact with their own constituents for a variety of reasons, this being only one of them. Nevertheless, the consequences of that was such that people said, whoa, look how strong the lobby is. And they did not want to go against them in the future. That said, Richard made the most important point, I thought. In this country, even with domestic constituency, a president will prevail on foreign policy if the president says, this is the national security interest of the United States. Mm-hmm. No domestic constituency can override the president no matter how powerful you are. That will not happen. It will not happen because nobody wants to be in Congress and say, I oppose the president on something that will be the national interest of the United States. I can give you a dozen examples of how, on issues that were terribly unpopular with Congress, the president prevailed. Panama Canal Treaty. The overwhelming majority of Americans believed the Panama Canal was, as Senator Hayakawa said, it's our canal, we stole it fair and square. And we didn't want to give that up. But when the president says it's in our vital national interest for Latin America that we ratify this treaty, the senators got in line and voted for it. And actually, 4 senators lost their seats because of that vote. As one of them said to me later, he said, I knew it was going to hurt, but I didn't realize how bad. It was. Another example was the Gulf War. Mm-hmm. When you got to the Gulf War, people will said, oh, what are they going to vote for on the January 15th vote in 1991? Are you going to delay this for 6 months? I said, how can you do that? How can Congress delay the president's use of force and trap those 500,000 American soldiers in the desert for 6 months and take responsibility for it? There's no way. They would have voted that 7 times and gotten it right because there's no way they could have stopped the president because the president said it was the national interest. The problem in the Middle East is how many issues are that vital to the American national interest? Most of the issues we talk about aren't. Therefore, if it's not the vital national interest of the United States, the administration the Congress is going to go its own direction and do its own thing and promote its own diet and respond totally to their domestic constituency. Only when the issue is the vital national interest will that be overrun. What's also happened over the last 20 years is one of the great characteristics of my former colleagues in the State Department is they tend to preemptively capitulate. When faced with a problem, they will give up if there's a strong enough voice against them. They will not challenge it. They will not debate it. They will walk away from it. And therefore, the supporters of the pro-Israeli position become this large blowfish out there, and no one wants to challenge it because it isn't worth the trouble, and they back away from it. The perfect example is arms sales to Arab countries. How many arms sales to Arab countries have ever been defeated by Congress? None. Why? If you don't want an arms sale, if you want to block an arms sale, you take the pressures you have and convince the administration they shouldn't send it up. It's going to be more trouble of work. You win by getting the State Department to preemptively capitulate and not send up the notification. Because what will happen if the notification? It'll pass. It's impossible on an arms sale to anybody to get 2/3 majority in both houses to stop it from going forward. So therefore, the way to stop it, and then you do this like you lobby anything else. You get a letter from 12 congressmen and from 4 senators saying, this is bad, it's terrible, don't do this, we'll fight you tooth and nail, and they don't send it up. Therefore, it is no question in my mind that people who do this are functioning in the interest and in the way of the United States. The only question that gets out there, and this is where anybody like me who says this publicly is in danger, but I will say this, it's the George Washington concern. George Washington, in his farewell address, warned against what he called a passionate attachment to another nation. What he says, a passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation facilitates the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interests exist. And infusing into one the enmities of the other betrays the former into participation in the quarrels and wars of the latter without adequate inducement or justification. The concern when you have only one side of the argument in a discussion is that you may have reached the point of where we have the passionate attachment as warned by George Washington.
Thanks, Graeme. Honesty and clarity are two very important qualities in life, in business and diplomacy and in politics. There's too little of it in Washington. I think these three presentations have been excellent and offered fresh perspective. I want to quickly add some observations of my own and then get to your questions. I'm going to do this very quickly because I want to leave as much time as possible for discussion and to see whether or not our panelists have any additional comments they want to add. Number one, in my judgment, the debate about domestic politics in America is too partisan and too dishonest. Too many in the pro-Israeli community are persuaded that domestic politics is essentially irrelevant to the formation of America's Middle East policy, and it all rests on value affinity. Too many of Israel's detractors, on the other hand, are persuaded that value affinity is irrelevant and domestic politics are the be-all and end-all. And if you took domestic politics away, there'd be no compelling case or interest in supporting the Israelis or permitting them the latitude that we do. Two, the fact is that in this system and with this particular problem, the interaction between domestic politics and value affinity is reasonably seamless. There is a pre-existing tilt in this country as a consequence of shared values, what I call value affinity with respect to America and the State of Israel, which is orchestrated, and orchestrated quite well and quite intensely, and elevated to the level of a survival issue for the pro-Israeli, particularly for the Jewish community. And that combination of a pre-existing tilt and domestic political orchestration provides a very powerful case. Three, that case is made on a daily basis by what I call Israel's lawyers. Now, when I initially developed this concept, and it isn't mine, it's Henry Kissinger's, I wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post in May of '05 on this subject, and it cost me an interview. I interviewed all of our former presidents for my book, except one. And he wouldn't see me because he was angry that I made the case that too many senior officials during the Clinton administration, including myself, had emerged as Israel's advocate only, and that if in fact you are an honest, forget it, not honest, if you want to be an effective broker, you must be a lawyer for each side. Otherwise you don't reach a deal. That's the essence of mediation. But on reflection, I decided that there really wasn't one lawyer, there were five. And these five lawyers create a case that is extremely compelling. The first is a passionate and well-organized Jewish community that, as Richard has demonstrated, lobbies well beyond its numbers, has a right to lobby and does it extremely well. The second is an effective congressional lobby, which in my judgment guards a pre-existing tilt and does have an impact when it comes to pro-Israeli statements, congressional legislation in Congress. The third are millions of evangelical Christians, both fundamentalist and traditional, who for reasons not just of eschatology, not just because of what happens at the end of time or the end of days, but for reasons of value affinity, have taken on, particularly after 9/11, a passionate interest in Israel. And the fourth are the Arabs themselves, or at least the American stereotyped embodiment of the Arabs, particularly since 9/11. And the Arabs in this case, and one non-Arab, President Ahmadinejad, has become, and he's not Arab, he's become the poster child for a reaffirmation of a solidly pro-American and pro-Israeli narrative. And finally, what I call the Jewish lobby of one, the impact that an Israeli prime minister has on an American secretary of state and an American president. No one who has not been in the process of American diplomacy can really understand the impact that Israeli prime ministers have on American presidents. Sometimes very positive, sometimes negative, but they are consequential. More on this in a minute. 4, in my judgment, these lawyers, and a lot of people object to this notion. Why would Israel need a lawyer? Why isn't the case so compellingly self-evident? But with all due respect to some of my Jewish friends, they're really not being honest with themselves. Because the fact is, American Jews have elevated the Israel issue to a survival issue. And since Jews worry for a living, that's something that's completely understandable given their history. The notion of having advocates to make your case is extremely important. And the Jewish community needs to be honest about it in terms of the public dialogue and discourse. But Israel's lawyers have made, in my judgment, a compelling case, which has brought us to the point where the conflict between Israel's supporters and detractors in America is over. It's done. And the pro-Israeli community has won, big time, way beyond what Professors Walt and Mearsheimer or even Jimmy Carter muses in his most fantastical moments about the conspiracy. Because it's not conspiracy. The idea of Israel has intertwined itself into American culture, into American politics, into American foreign policy in a way that, in my judgment, barring some fundamental reorientation, that is to say, Israel becomes something else, the special relationship between the United States and Israel is secure. 5, the question is not that. And President Obama and McCain have to ask themselves the question. The issue is not whether or not America is committed to its special relationship with Israel. It is. The question is to whether or not we will allow the special relationship, which frankly works to our advantage, both because we're a democracy committed to supporting fellow democracies and because of the paradox of the partial mediator. The politically incorrect answer to why America's phone still rings with respect to the Arab-Israeli conflict, even though our credibility from one end of the region to the other has been demolished. The politically correct answer is that our phone rings because of our relationship with the Israelis, not in spite of it. It's the paradox of the partial mediator. However, 6, what has happened is that the special relationship has, in my judgment, become an exclusive relationship. And in becoming exclusive for the last 16 years, 8 under President Bill Clinton and 8 under George W. Bush, we have undermined the effectiveness of our role as a mediator. In allowing our tactics and strategies to be subject to Israeli veto, in not demanding reciprocity from the Israelis when it comes to issues like settlement activity and land confiscation, and in giving the Israelis the wide latitude that both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush had done, we have failed. Now, whether or not we could have succeeded in negotiating permanent status agreements between Israel and the Palestinians and Israel and the Syrians is an arguable proposition. There are obstacles intrinsic to those negotiations, but we don't have a chance of doing it. Not a chance, unless we preserve a measure of independence, both in the tactics of our policy and in our strategy. And this is where the influence of an Israeli prime minister on an American president becomes determinative. And I saw it both with the late Prime Minister Rabin and Clinton. I saw it with Ehud Barak and Bill Clinton. And I saw it also with Ariel Sharon and George W. Bush. It's a very compelling case if you're an American president faced with an authoritative, historic, legitimate Israeli prime minister, when you yourself want to succeed at peacemaking, to say no. To say, I'm sorry, Mr. Prime Minister, we're not going to go to Camp David in July of 2000. We're not ready. Or if we're going on a basis that allows me the chance either to succeed or to fail in a way that preserves our credibility and the negotiating process itself. And this is the danger, it seems to me, of allowing the special relationship to become exclusive. 7, we have 3 historic examples of Americans who have, in my judgment, done consequential diplomacy. We can argue all day long about whether they deserve to be in the Peace Process Hall of Fame or not. I argue that they should be admitted because they succeeded. Henry Kissinger, using Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, and the first President Bush and James Baker. Different kinds of successes. It's not coincidental that all demanded control over the tactics and strategies of their policies. It's not coincidental that all tangled with not only Israeli prime ministers, but domestic political lobbies. But it's also not coincidental that in doing so, in taking on the rigors of mediation, these 3 succeeded. It is an occupational hazard when it comes to mediation. You can be respected, but you're never going to be loved. 8, restoring this balance very much requires the prospects of success. Because only when an American president believes he has a chance of succeeding will that president or secretary of state expose themselves and their administration to the vagaries and challenges of the American political system. All 3 panelists said it. There are very few national interests that America is going to take that seriously. National interests that can get an American president in deep trouble domestically, and national interests that would allow them to succeed or fail in the high wire act of the international stage. So it is both because of the chances of success and using success to cover the toughness of your policies that American presidents and secretaries of state can, in fact, lead. 9, domestic lobbies have a powerful voice, and the pro-Israeli community lobby has a very powerful voice. It does not, however, have a veto. Not when an American president identifies an enterprise as a national interest. Not when that American president does effective diplomacy, and not when that American president does lobbying of his own to create domestic constituencies in favor of that policy. We can, in fact, succeed. 9, frankly, given our record of failure, 8 years of failed peacemaking under Bill Clinton and 8 years of failed war making under George W. Bush, we have gotten to a point where we are neither admired, feared, or respected, according to my friend Richard Strauss, in a region that is increasingly critical to our national interests. And I don't know what it will take to put one of those particular interests, the Arab-Israeli issue, on the front burner. In the case of Kissinger, it took a real crisis, the October War. In the case of Jimmy Carter, it took an extraordinary opportunity, which no one could ignore. In the case of the president's father and Jim Baker, it took a war, which we frankly won, and won with minimum damage and casualties, and the emergence of a brief moment when in fact America was respected, feared, and admired in 1991. What it will take, I don't know. But in the end, I know this. It's all about leadership. We have convinced ourselves, and I would put myself at the head of the class on this, that we cannot be a friend of Israel and an effective mediator at the same time. We need to unconvince ourselves. All right, we're done with the presentations. I think in the respecting the clock, we probably should go to Q&As unless.
I had 3 quick points I wanted to make. I could very quickly do them,
Sure.
if you would. Yeah, just, I mean, very quickly. First, just to enrich it a little bit, and it's an interesting irony, but it's worth noting that you're absolutely right when you make the distinction between Israel's defenders and Israel's detractors on whether domestic politics has any effect on policy, except when it comes to Israel's Jewish detractors on the far left, who revert back to the idea that domestic politics is insignificant and go instead to some kind of amorphous imperial interest that supposedly transcends. So you get people like Chomsky and Phyllis Bennis and Stephen Zunis and a whole crew of people who wave away the notion that AIPAC is of any serious consequence. And I thought I'd note that, because it's interesting.
There's one other point with respect to the Jewish community that needs to be made, and that is it's obviously not a monolith. And there are groups within the community that have served as pressure points on administrations to go faster rather than to constrain themselves. But the reality is that the groups that set the tone for the Jewish community's official face in Washington are not those groups. They're the Conference of Presidents, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, and the committees. So I think I don't, and we shouldn't, create the image that this is a monolithic community without great diversity and richness.
And yet they still agree on the irrelevancy of domestic politics in shaping the policy. So there's an interest. I mean, they come together on that one issue. Everything else they disagree on. But they do agree that domestic politics is irrelevant. The other 2 things I want to say very quickly is that if exclusivity is the problem, and I think you're right, then the policy that I was talking about, the policy is the solution to the politics. In other words, if it's true that there isn't a zero-sum relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, even though many people who kind of know that at an intellectual level proceed emotionally as if there were, and we can't divorce ourselves from this sort of orientation of mutual confrontation, that if it's true that Israel and Palestine and the Arabs and the Israelis, etc., broadly speaking, need the same thing, then it's not a great challenge to continue the special relationship with Israel while building additional warm relations with the Palestinians who want to make peace with Israel, the Arabs who want to live in peace with Israel, etc. And the 2 things are not exclusive. It's only when we revert to a zero-sum conception of Middle Eastern strategy that this special relationship becomes an unendurable burden. And as evidence, and that was the 3rd thing I was going to cite, was Graeme's question about arms sales. Well, a very interesting thing just happened, which is a very huge package of arms sales to Israel and a bunch of Arab states that probably Friends of Israel in the past would have spent a lot of time opposing, and they were bundled together as an overall package by the administration, very intelligently, to get it through and to make the point that Israel, given the present strategic realities in the Middle East, actually has no reason to oppose these arms sales to these Arab states, and that, in fact, it's other states in the region who are contemplated as being somehow or other on the other side of these weapons. And what that shows, again, I think, is how far we've gone away from a Middle East in which you've got Israelis over here and Arabs over here, and there's absolutely nothing that they have in common, no shared interests, nothing of the kind. And we have to proceed on that basis in Washington. I think we're long past that, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, let's, we have the revolving mics. Let's go to the questions. Mark? Please identify yourself.
My name is Mark Heller. I have a couple of questions, if I might be permitted. First of all, to Hussein Ibish. I'm not sure I understood from your description of a kind of a consensus, almost a universal consensus, including all the domestic lobbies, about what the shape of the outcome ought to be. Mm. If that's the case, so what's the problem? Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Secondly, I guess to all the panelists, I know that you're not charged with doing any kind of comparative analysis here, but I wondered if you could speculate about why what we see happening in the United States doesn't happen in other democracies, including some democracies which are presidential systems and have fairly large and active Jewish communities. I'm thinking in particular of France. And I forget my third question, so that's enough.
Okay. Briefly, I think the reality is, I mean, the consensus I'm describing is a consensus of authorities, of governments, of the UN Security Council, of the Arab League, major states of the Arab League, of the majority of Palestinians, majority of Americans, majority of Israelis. But that doesn't mean there isn't significant resistance from serious political forces with major constituencies behind them. You've got in the three principal actors, Israel and its polity, United States, Palestinians, you've got significant concentrations of dedicated opposition that work without consultation but in concert with each other to try to sabotage any progress. In the United States, you've got people committed to greater Israel, people so committed that they regard any compromise that Israel might make as some kind of treason against the almighty will. You've got supporters of the settler community, etc., and certainly others operating in Israel and in the United States who oppose it on that end. And you've got very strong resistance to an agreement on the Palestinian side, represented by the Islamist constituency, Hamas, and other groups even further to the right. And this is spread throughout the Arab and Islamic world, and you've got an anti-regional order, anti-status quo coalition being built, that has been built up, especially since the invasion of Iraq by Iran and its allies, that works 24/7 to sabotage it. So I'm not trying to tell you that everyone agrees completely. Plus, there are very significant problems in getting the parties that want to make an agreement to agree on the details. The details are exceptionally difficult, exceptionally painful. The old city is certainly something that requires finessing. The refugees, you have to get the language right. I think there's a general understanding of the broad outlines, but the devil's in the details. So obviously, it's not like I'm saying it's simple. Once we just face up to the truth, it gets done. But what I am saying is that it's time to stop letting extremists override the needs of these societies and the wishes of their solid majorities.
And if I could be permitted, because Hussein's answer reminded me what the third question was. As I listened to the panel, it struck me that you kind of all fell victim to what seems to be some kind of habitual failing in Washington, namely that it's all everything is all up to the United States. My question is precisely about overcoming the, let's say, domestic opposition or obstruction to what you described as a fairly widespread consensus. My assumption, correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron, is that you believe that if the United States pursued the kind of involvement which you seem to be recommending, that would be helpful to an Israeli mainstream to overcome its domestic opposition or its obstructionists. Is the same true about the Palestinians, or do you need to bring others in as well to achieve that on the Palestinian side?
Well, first of all, I think you may have misconstrued what I had to say. I believe when there is opportunity generated by crisis or in the case of the 1973 war or Sadat, that America has a chance to play a role. I do not believe that somehow you can build or make bricks without straw, unless the fundamental building blocks are in place. America's diplomatic effort, this the notion that great powers can somehow take conflicts that are rooted in religious triumphalism and an existential reality and resolve them. There's no historical precedent for this. What I'm suggesting is when, in fact, opportunities arise, as they did in the three cases in which we actually did consequential diplomacy, and I will defend this to my dying day, and I worked for 6 secretaries of state, only 3 Americans in 50 years managed to do the kind of diplomacy that actually led to agreements or consequential developments that had real potential. And all of them responded to crisis or opportunity, but then summoned up the leadership and the will to do effective diplomacy. Kissinger, Carter, and Baker. So I believe that unless there is real willingness on the part of Arab and Israeli leaders to take decisive action, our diplomacy will not succeed. And I'm not sure we can fundamentally transform the calculations of others, no matter what we do.
Aaron, if I might, I'd like to I think in those three examples, the United States acts when its own national interests were deeply involved. I think, for example, in 1976, we at the Department of State were preparing for whoever won the election because American national interest was necessary for peace between Arabs and Israel, between Egypt and Israel, and hopefully the Arabs and Israel, for three reasons. One, we had just suffered a war in '73 that almost dragged us into a conflict with the Soviet Union. We both mobilized our troops, and we had to stop that, put that fire out so it didn't threaten us again going to war with the Soviet Union. Two, you had the oil embargo. We needed to, and put us into a recession in '73 to '74. That's the worst recession we've seen, except for possibly now. And it was essential to us, and we needed to get this off the table. So what we did at the State Department at that time, we literally prepared briefing books on Sinai, West Bank, Golan Heights, thick books, maps, possibilities, everything that was there, preparing for whoever won the presidency, because we had no doubt. We had absolutely no doubt that whoever was president had to address this issue because of our national interest. All three. The problem right now is, who can honestly say that what goes on there affects a vital national interest of the United States? That's why it's going to be difficult to get into. The other question that wasn't answered was, why don't the Europeans have the lobbyists like we do?
They didn't have Madison. And so they don't have a separation of powers?
They don't have the divided government. They don't have, for example, the party that wins the majority of the election forms the government. So therefore, the foreign policy is decided by the foreign ministry and they carry the parliament. We have this natural conflict between executive and legislature and party, and that opens it up for the lobby.
Can I just say, just quickly to answer the question, you're right, of course, there's no question. The onus falls primarily on the Israelis and the Palestinians. I mean, they're the parties, they're the ones who have to make the agreement. The United States is a facilitator and has a key role because of its power and the fact that it's the regional power in the Middle East, now challenged by a would-be second regional power, but it's not there yet and may not emerge. So, but having acknowledged that and that how much work there is for the Israelis and the Palestinians to do, much more than there is to do in Washington, it's still true that our policies either promote or discredit the Palestinians who want to make peace. There are competing factions in Palestine, those who want to make peace and those who don't. We've talked about that, and in Israel, and here. And I think it would be really blind not to recognize that there is no such thing as benign neglect here. There's no such thing as conflict management. There's only conflict metastasis. It doesn't stay the same. It's not stable. It doesn't just go on to be dealt with in 10 years or 20 years. It gets worse. It changes for the worse, and it continues to develop. And so we have choices at every policy level. It's not just about whether the final agreement is made or not. It's everything we do that ultimately affects our ability to make this happen or not, you see.
Maurice, how about down here?
Mohammed Shinaw, Voice of America. With the financial economic crisis taking top priority right now, how would the new president be actively engaged in solving the Arab-Israeli conflict, and which candidate do you think believe it is a U.S. national security?
Governing is about choosing. That's what it means to govern. You decide what's important to you and what isn't. The next president is going to face, even before the meltdown of markets and a global economic crisis, a number of priorities that will transcend the Arab-Israeli issue. First is a campaign promise. either McCain or Obama. Extrication of American forces from Iraq according to some reasonable timetable, and with withdrawal, leaving something that approximates a measure of stability. Second, a priority driven by a ticking clock, not an election, which is the issue of Iranian nuclear proliferation. And what, if anything, happens if the fuel cycle is completed and Iran takes steps to weaponize? You have another country in this region that has already made clear that possession of a weapon is simply unacceptable. And regularizing our relationship with the Iranians. Those two priorities are huge. I believe that the Arab-Israeli issue will figure prominently, certainly in an Obama administration. The question is how to engage without failing, and how to engage without creating an artificial sense of process that further diminishes and undermines American credibility. And my last comment is, if I were advising the next president, and I'm not, if I were running for something, and I am not, it's clear what opportunity exists, and it is not the fractiousness of a hopelessly complex Israeli-Palestinian confrontation. It is the Israeli-Syrian negotiation, which offers to a smart, pragmatic, practical president the possibility of success. And remember, keep in mind, and we can argue about this all day long, no new president, certainly not one that is untested in foreign policy, on whose shoulders huge expectations have already been laid, wants to and can court an early failure. If there's any engagement that offers the prospects of success, it is clearly an Israeli-Syrian agreement for so many reasons, including the ripple effect of dealing with Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran. It's so compelling if, in fact, an American president were interested. Yes. Ted?
Yeah, Ted Katouf. I want to make a few brief observations and then have the panel comment on it. First one involves something that Richard Strauss said, and Richard and I over the years have found we don't agree on much, but I know that we're both pulling for Penn State to be national champions.
Undefeated, yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, that's right.
No.
Both alums.
All right. Richard mentioned, it's sort of throwbacks after Schultz, Bush Baker, with his background in AIPAC and then later in writing a newsletter, et cetera. But what did Bush Baker try to do, Richard? They dragged Shamir kicking and screaming to Madrid because he famously said, I need 10 more years to settle the West Bank and Gaza so nobody can ever give back the land. And at some point, loan guarantees to help settle refugees or immigrants from the Soviet Union, that to the extent that Shamir spent our money on settlements, we would cut back on the amount available for loan guarantees. Today, we have almost double the number of settlements, probably double the number of settlers we had then. I don't see how that was pro-Israeli to allow that to happen during the Clinton administration and now the Bush administration. So it seems to me that AIPAC really has, rather than just a pro-Israeli a pro-Israeli mission, that it's tilted rightward, that it's been willing to defend things that in the long run are not good for Israel and not good for the United States. Also, it seems to me there's been some there's no question about the special relationship with Israel. We've heard that from Hussein, we've heard that from Aaron, we've heard that from everybody. That's not up for debate. But I think there is debate suppression in this country about some of Israel's policies. Jimmy Carter wrote a book somewhat ineptly titled Peace, Not Apartheid. If I were in his position, I would not have used the word apartheid, but he did. And again, a firestorm of criticism, having to defend himself, etc. And if I'm not mistaken, Omer, the Prime Minister of Israel, just left office and said, you know, if we allow this situation to continue and we don't get a two-state solution, we're going to be lost. We'll have apartheid. And silence, nothing said. And then just sort of delegitimization of a whole group of people in this country. We just had a woman stand up at one of these town hall meetings and say to McCain, I think, isn't this Obama? He's an Arab, isn't he? He's an Arab. I'm still looking for a major newspaper op-ed to say anything about this. Now, if she had said in somewhat a derogatory tone, you know, let's say Obama was white, and she said, he's really passing, isn't he? Or he's really a Jew, isn't he? I can't imagine what the outcry would have been. But nobody commented on the fact that actually there is a American of Arab heritage on the ballot, Ralph Nader. The Republicans honored at their convention a guy named Michael Mansour, a Navy SEAL who was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor and happens to be of Lebanese extraction, or the fact that several generals have served this country in major commands who are of Arab heritage. So I'm not worried about the special relationship. I'm not worried about any of that. But I am worried about the fact that we don't seem to be able to debate these issues without words like anti-Semitic and the like being thrown at people.
Let me answer, Ted. Just give a bit of my answer. When I was at AIPAC in 1977, and I think every year subsequently, there's been an attempt like this. There was an organization, I'm not sure it's still in existence, I don't follow it that closely, called the NAAA, National Association of Arab Americans. And we always...
It doesn't exist.
Okay. But in its day, it was, I think, the major... Its attempt was to give a balance on another side of the argument. Their newsletter was exactly like AIPAC's newsletter. The same letterhead, everything was the same number of pages. It was an attempt to balance. It doesn't exist anymore as an organization. It never had the kind of circulation. The nearest report, AIPAC's in-house or newspaper had. And I think for this reason that I was talking about earlier in my introductory remarks, and that is that starting in 1979 with the Iran hostage crisis and going through 9/11 into the Iraq War, you're talking about the other side of the equation being viewed as hostile to the United States. Israel had an open door to walk through. It wasn't as if they stifled debate. It was events. That's what I was trying to emphasize. Events that have conspired, if you like, to make the argument one-sided. Nobody asks what the full name of Ben Bernanke is. But they do ask about the middle name of Barack Obama. And the reason is because the middle name of Bernanke's middle name is a Hebrew middle name, but it doesn't seem threatening because I can't remember the last time the Israelis attacked the United States for American interests. Some would say the Liberty in 1967. But it's very recent that those from the Arab world have been perceived, and perceived correctly, as enemies of the United States. And so it is just understandable, the American people, and through their elected representatives, and that's when we were talking before about what kind of government we have here, with separation of powers, so that you have an independent legislative branch which can express these kinds of views. I mean, I know I've worked long enough with people at the State Department to know how longingly they look across the ocean at Whitehall and at Quai d'Orsay to their counterparts who can come up with a policy, and then it's taken into effect right away because there's no opposition from the legislature. There's no independent counterweight. So the American people have taken in these events from Iran hostage to 9/11, and they've absorbed them. They have them expressed most vocally and most crudely, perhaps, by their elected representatives. I mean, they are people's representatives, and they speak with the people's voices. You saw it most recently in the bailout, how angry the people were, and it was expressed through their representatives. And so I think it's only natural to expect that kind of bias when you have the events that you've seen over the past quarter of a century.
No.
No, but I'm saying it's all part of a piece, Ted. It's the same piece that you have. It's a one-sided debate, and the one side is very positive, and the other side tends to be negative for the same reasons. There's an identity of a community of interests, which people may say is too close. George Washington could say it's too close. I mean, but that's one side of it. The other side of it is that what is it, 16 out of the 19 hijackers? 17?
15.
15 out of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. None of them were Israelis.
Now, let me. I find. Can I say something? I've always agreed. I've always agreed with Richard and Ted. Unlike you, who didn't seem to agree.
How's that possible?
I don't know how it's possible. I'm a little worried about that. But I want to make a technical correction. I think it is wrong to call AIPAC as pro-Israel. I think if you speak to people who belong to AIPAC, they're pro-America, and they believe that the strong Israeli-American relationship is in America's interest. And so, therefore, I think it's. I mean, people argue the other side of it, but that's not what people who join it think and believe. They're doing it because they believe it's in the American national interest. Now, but on the other hand, I think Richard underestimates the pressure political people feel to disagree with Israel. I mean, you cannot go on Capitol Hill and spend any time talking to members or staff and have this issue come up and they take their political interest into concern.
Yeah, but let me respond to this for a second. A mutual friend of ours, who I think neither of us disagree with very often, Brad Gordon, once told me the story. It was a number of years ago, before Israel and Iran, way before Ahmadinejad, and the problems of the Iranian nuclear arsenal, potential nuclear arsenal came up. He was addressing an AIPAC group, and he was asked to explain what AIPAC's priorities were for the coming year. And this is maybe 9 years ago. And he listed the priorities: more aid for Israel, deal with, move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He goes down a whole list. And then he asked for questions. And the first question is, what about Iran? And he kind of fumbled through it and said, yes, of course, Iran's a priority as well. And when he told me the story, he said, the reason I didn't mention Iran on the list is because all I have to do is walk into a congressman's office and say, I've got a resolution on Iran, and the congressman says, where do I sign? And it's not because he's afraid of AIPAC. It's because going back to 1979, Iran has been perceived to be incredibly hostile. And it's an open door for those who want to pursue a certain policy, because the other side has not just abdicated its role, but has become hostile in it.
Yes, Ziad.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I wish I had a couple of hours to elaborate on some of the things that I've heard today, but I will just choose a couple of minutes if I may. Yes, the problem is now between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and whatever happens in the United States is not going to be decisive to a point to resolve the conflict one way or the other. You have to have things on the ground in Palestine and Israel. But we need to remember that Israel occupies Palestine. So there's a major imbalance of power in Palestine. There is no way that the Palestinian leadership can get itself out of the predicament that it is in without help from Israel and from the United States. What we're talking about now is a need for changes within the United States and between the Palestinians and the Israelis to stop looking at this conflict in tribal, ethnic, racial terms. We cannot resolve it if the Jews are going to help Israel, the Arabs are going to help Palestine. This is nonsensical, frankly, and too primitive. We need to be guided by an objective. How do we get out of this predicament? We need to decide, at least those of us who intend to resolve this seriously, is to look at an objective, which is to get a two-state solution. Anything, any action, any idea, any motivation, any political formation that prevents us from leading to a two-state solution, whether it starts in Israel or in Palestine or in the United States, has to cause an alignment for those who are opposed to the two-state solution. Those of us who are for a two-state solution have failed miserably to generate political power in interlinking within the United States and within Palestine, within Israel, to cause a political mass, a political pressure point that could roll back the veto power that everybody talks about. I think this is something we can do, and this is something we should do. Thank you.
I would, Ziad, you know that we've had a long conversation on this issue for many years, but I can no longer engage in what I consider to be illusions with respect to why American secretaries of state and presidents behave the way they do. I believe fundamentally that politicians and those who govern have less faith in capitalism, nationalism, or democracy as their compelling ideologies, and much more faith in success. Because success in the end becomes the world's most compelling ideology. Because success generates power, and success generates constituents, and failure generates the opposite. No president of the United States, when faced with the kinds of galactic problems that the next president will face here and abroad, is going to go chasing problems that cannot be managed with success by him or somehow resolved successfully by him. We have failed for 16 years in our capacity to help Arabs and Israelis make peace, and failed even more galactically in our efforts to use preventative or preemptive war to address our national security issues in this region. And if you look out at the world right now from the perspective of the next president, he's going to want to know, where can I make an impact? Where can I do something that in fact will lead reasonably quickly to the perception that I am succeeding and ultimately to a success? And how does that correlate with the broader issues that I now confront? One is Iraq, which is a campaign commitment. The other is Iran, which, as I mentioned, I would argue is a time commitment. There is a ticking clock here. And if you asked me, and I opposed emphasis on the Israeli-Syrian negotiation because I thought we would fail and we would make it almost impossible to address what I still consider to be the central issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is the Israeli-Palestinian problem. But the Palestinian national movement is confronting its worst crisis in 50 years. The Palestinian Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall and it's shattered. There's no monopoly over negotiating strategy. There's no monopoly over the forces of violence within Palestinian society. It's split geographically, politically, psychologically. And on the other side, where is the leadership on the Israeli side? Where's the moral authority, the historical legitimacy, even the electoral legitimacy to lead the people of Israel to the kinds of decisions they need to make in order to have a successful negotiating process? So I am Barack Obama or John McCain, and I'm looking out at all of this. Here's what I say. We'll manage to the degree we can, and it may be illusory. I've seen this movie before, but I will go to a place where I think I can actually get an agreement and maybe in the process shake things up on the truly strategic issues that confront America. And that means Israel-Syria, that means Iran, and even Lebanon. I don't see the Israeli-Palestinian track being paramount unless something happens among Israelis or Palestinians.
Yeah, but here's the missing piece, which is that if we do nothing or just continue with the policies that we've had, probably won't change. But it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. I mean, what you've got to do is not expect to enter on the top floor of a 14-story building, but rather on the bottom floor and work your way up stage by stage. So I would argue again, as I was to your question, sir, that we've got to align our policies very carefully to move us in stages to where we need to go. And one of the things we need to look at very carefully is how our policies affect internal debates in Israel and among the Palestinians. And it's true enough that Palestinian polity split and that there's a split in leadership and there's a certain discrediting or there was anyway for a while, of forces that wanted to make peace with Israel. That was not that didn't happen in a vacuum. That didn't happen completely independently of things that were done and not done in the United States. You had more than a year in which Abu Mazen and his faction were, enjoyed exclusive authority among the Palestinians. And what happened? To promote those people, to make life easier for them, to get the Palestinian public to believe in their agenda and their strategy and what have you. Basically nothing. Pretty much nothing. So I really do think that we have to be, if we want to get to where we're going to go, we have to be serious about how we can help get it there. Well, acknowledging that, yes, the ultimate decisions aren't made here, they're made there by them, etc. But we can help get them to where they need to go, especially when it comes to the Palestinians, who are, greatly influenced and dependent on other parties. The other thing is that the Israel-Syria track might seem attractive on the grounds that you can imagine these entities doing a deal, but it doesn't resolve anything of enormous strategic importance to the United States. The conflict goes on. It doesn't bring peace to the Middle East. It doesn't end the Arab-Israeli conflict. It doesn't bring peace to Israel or freedom to the Palestinians or a consolidated status quo in the region to the United States, I don't think, unless it's a subsection of an overall grand bargain with Iran, which I don't think you're talking about it being. It seems to me like a Band-Aid on an amputation or something like that. It's not. It doesn't get you where you need to go at all. So I don't know.
I'm just suggesting that if the past is any precedent, you need 3 or 4 things for a successful negotiation.
Yeah.
You need leadership. Where is it on the Israeli and Palestinian side? You need urgency. The status quo has to become unacceptable. I mean, how many times would we have all agreed that the status quo between Israelis and Palestinians is unacceptable? You need a third-party mediator who's prepared to really take it on, and in the end, be tough with both sides. But there's no question that will involve a fair amount of tension with the Israelis. And finally, you need a doable deal. That's the 4th piece. Mm-hmm. You need a doable deal. Now, we can go off and we can say, well, Jerusalem borders, refugees, and security. I mean, the parties are this close to a solution. We can do this again and harbor the kinds of illusions that we've harbored over the past several years on these issues. They're not this close. It's an illusion. Right. So I'm a practical politician. I'm a president. I look and I see 2 states, limited number of settlements on the Golan Heights, no emotional issues, no Jerusalem, no religion, no refugees. And I think, let me try this one.
But no emotion invested.
Yeah. That's the point. It does. It doesn't address your strategic problems. Going down the list one by one.
Not campaigning for it.
I understand that. I understand that.
It's the default. It's the default position.
Well, it'd be easier to get an agreement in any random place. I mean, it's not going to solve America's strategic needs. So I mean, you can make a deal between I don't know.
It's a little more consequential.
It doesn't solve the strategic problems we've been worrying about. Leadership is there. It just needs to be strengthened on both sides. It's weakened and discredited.
It reminds me very much of...
I was going to go down the list, but I think there are answers.
But that kind of comment reminds me very much of... In 2002, there was an interview in the New York Times with Colin Powell, and he gets this criticism that the administration has gotten for many years. Why aren't you more active in the peace process? Which is sort of what you're talking about, what people talk about all the time. And Powell answered, it was buried in the page A18 or something, and his answer I thought was very interesting. He said, whenever anybody talks about the United States getting more involved in the peace process, what they really mean is the United States should tell Israel to do something that Israel doesn't want to do. I think that is a political problem that is masked by a lot of talk about goodwill and the need for change for peace. The fact is that the United States is expected when people talk about it to do something about Israel. Because
that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking, and I'll say it again. I've said it at least 3 times. I want to say it again because we need to break old-fashioned thinking where you've got Israel here and the Palestinians here, and you support one or the other, and it's a zero-sum. It's not that. One of the things the United States could do that would be very helpful, that would be an important step in getting us to where we need to go, is to wholeheartedly and enthusiastically support that wing of the Palestinian national movement and that political faction in Palestine that wants to make a deal. They are being neglected, and not benignly. And actually other Arab leaderships that are interested in this kind of thing in other places are also being damned with faint support and set up to bear the burden of a close relationship with the United States, but not reap the rewards and have the responsibilities without the rights. It's a completely unbalanced situation. If you look at it and ask me, what kind of effect is that going to have on these policies in the Arab world, among Palestinians, among Lebanese, etc., I would tell you it's going to greatly discredit them. And I would tell you that in the long run it's going to put us in this position of saying, well, who could we go to? Where's the deal? We can't make a deal. Yeah, of course, if we're going to take our friends and damn them with faint support and put them in an impossible situation and make everyone believe that they're wishing for some chimera that would never happen, and there's no point in being friendly to the United States and wanting to reconcile with Israel and live alongside Israel in peace and security, and that's just a ridiculous strategy, then we can do that very, very effectively. But I don't think that's an intelligent policy for the United States at all.
Okay, how about the third row right here?
Hi, my name's Elena Farsakh, and I actually live over in Palestine, or I try to pretty regularly. And I guess I sort of want to feed off what Dr. Ibish was just speaking about, and that has to do with the notion of, sorry, I lost my train of thought. What I'm concerned about is, this is what I wanted to say before you spoke, so I'll just say that. And that is, I find it kind of disingenuous when people keep saying the Arab-Israeli conflict, and to talk about, well, the Palestinians have to do this and the Israelis have to do that. I have a problem with that, because I can't think of one thing, and maybe somebody here can maybe refresh my memory, but one thing that the Israelis have done to fulfill anything that's been requested of them to move towards peace. Every time I go there, I see the settlements expanding. Last November, when we were doing the Annapolis conference here, the Israelis did a massive incursion into the West Bank, and my cousin Ziad was beaten to death by 3 Israeli soldiers in his store. And there's really not, for what's going on the ground there, we're talking about a lot of things that are kind of high-minded, but how we are viewed over there, and I guess this goes to what you were saying, is very important. How we're perceived there. People don't see Obama or McCain being any different from what we have now. Obama's speech that he made at AIPAC was, I feel, a huge misstep, and I think he got carried away a little bit. And when you have somebody like Olmert saying what he's just said, you need to have people to see that maybe we need to give Israel some tough love, and not just what you were saying, Dr. Strauss. I think, doing something that Israel doesn't want us to do. Well, sorry. I mean, there's never going to be peace. When people keep seeing things getting worse for them on the ground, it's not going to happen. And also, I guess you mentioned that you were going to talk about the media somewhat, and you haven't really touched on that. And obviously, that's a big piece of the puzzle in terms of what's pushed forward as one person's agenda or another person's agenda, and what people actually get to know here. Thanks. Sorry to eat up so much time.
I would only briefly say that I don't believe this conflict is a morality play that pits the forces of goodness on one hand against the forces of darkness on the other. It's a complicated conflict in which both sides bear responsibility. We could argue all day long whether they're symmetrical responsibilities, but the current state of affairs came as a consequence of the unraveling of the first historic opportunity that Israelis and Palestinians ever got to actually look and recognize one another, and both proceeded almost as quickly as the Oslo agreements and their implementation mechanisms were signed to begin to violate their commitments. So this is a unique conflict. It's not the Israeli-Egyptian, Israeli-Jordanian, Israeli-Syrian conflict. It's driven primarily by proximity, and that proximity has created an occupier and an occupied, and they play their roles. They play their roles, and it's a dance in which both are responsible for. And I'm not sure we understand that, because if we did, I think we'd find a way to be tougher, fairer, and more balanced in the way we relate to this particular conflict. But I don't think for the last 16 years we have been that. So, anyway. Yes, in the back, way in the back.
Hi, my name's Nick DeGroat. I'm an intern here at the Wilson Center. Thanks so much for this really important discussion. I just would like to hear your thoughts on, since you mentioned, Mr. Miller, about third parties, the two candidates' approach. It seems like Obama would like to utilize the United Nations as a platform for diplomacy, and McCain doesn't seem so confident about that. I'd just like to hear what you guys think.
I mean, I'm not. I will say one thing, but I hope you'll chime in. Frankly, I don't think it matters whether it is Barack Obama or John McCain on the question of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. It does not matter. I just came off 4 months of selling a book from one end of America to the other, and the most frequently asked question I get is, who's going to be better for Arab-Israeli peace or the U.S.-Israeli relationship in Jewish audiences, Obama or McCain? The fact is, on the question of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, it doesn't matter. It doesn't. The special relationship is intact. It will continue to thrive. Our preference for the Israelis, we're not an honest broker. We can be an effective broker, but we will always have closer relations with one side than we will with the other. And I think that's almost, it's impossible to ignore without being naive. I do believe it matters with respect to Arab-Israeli peace. Mm-hmm. And therein will be the interesting question. Because the farther along you go on the road to a negotiation, whether it's on the Israeli-Palestinian track or the Israeli-Syrian negotiations, an American mediator will face moments in which you're going to have to say loudly and clearly to both, but particularly to the Israelis, in large part because they have, with respect to land, what others want. You're going to either have to say no, or it won't work, or I'm sorry, if you want an American auspices for your negotiation, this is the way it's going to have to be. It has nothing to do with fundamentally jeopardizing your security. If you want American support for it, it's nothing to do with our commitment to your security. If you want our auspices to help you in negotiation, there are certain measures of reciprocity that we will insist upon. Kissinger insisted on it. Carter insisted on it. Baker insisted on it. Neither Clinton nor Bush got involved in this way. So I think, frankly, if Obama wins, there's a much better chance that you will end up with a serious negotiating process. It is highly arguable, however, and debatable whether or not Barack Obama will have the toughness, the detachment, and the courage to essentially be tough. Nobody can answer that question right now, but it's going to take a lot in order to do it. Yes, in his third row. You, sorry.
Ross Allen from the British Embassy here in Washington. You've spoken a lot about the domestic lobby. What influence do you think it'll have for the new president in sort of day one or day two when leaders from the Arab states or from some of the countries in Europe have their sort of first phone call if the MEP is top of the list that they present the new president with? Do you think that will have any, would have any influence or not?
George W. Bush was influenced to some degree by Tony Blair, and by King Abdullah of Jordan, and by the Saudis. But it wasn't the kind of consequential influence and impact that would have pushed him to engage in this issue. I don't think there is any single leader that has the capacity to tell the next American president, you need to involve yourself in the Arab-Israeli issue, and as a consequence of a letter, a meeting, a phone call, they will do it. You know, Larry Summers, who said a lot of very controversial things, which is why he's not president of Harvard anymore, but a very smart guy, once said that, and I've used this line before, in the history of the world, he said, nobody ever washed a rental car. And Larry's point was quite profound in terms of philosophy, of governance. You only care about what you own. And neither Tony Blair, the King of Jordan, the President of Egypt, can tell an American president what he should own. That judgment comes as a consequence, as Graeme pointed out, of a calculation as to what serves the national interest and what are the prospects of, and I'll say it again, success. It is that interaction that will determine how involved, how important, and how courageous an American president is prepared to be on the issue of Middle East peace. Alan.
Alan Brown from the Canadian Embassy. I'd like to get the views of the panel a little bit about the question of the apartheid element, because this seems to be maybe another ticking bomb for Israel. And just to get a view, given the views expressed on the panel about the strength of the American relationship with Israel and its affinity with the values of Israel, at what point do you think the apartheid concern actually will affect that relationship? Is there a ticking bomb here?
This isn't the Aaron Miller show. I'll offer one comment, and then we're going to have to go. I said, and I believe it, that the debate in this country is over with respect to the special relationship for many different reasons, including domestic politics, but that's not the most consequential in my judgment. When the image of when the image of Israel in the mind of America and its elites and its public opinion begins to fundamentally change, in essence, when Israel becomes something else, no longer, again, in the mind of America, no longer a tiny state in a very dangerous neighborhood facing innumerable odds, when that image of a like-minded democratic polity fundamentally alters, then over time, the American commitment and relationship with Israel will necessarily alter. But I don't believe that that process is, even with the demography, will be one that will be quickly evident. And I'm talking about a generational proposition here, not a matter of one administration or the other. Over time, it is possible, of course. Polities change their character. Images change. But it'll be torturously slow, even with the conflict.
Can I address that quickly, too? You want to go first?
I'll go first.
Yeah,
I was going to say on the apartheid issue, there is no question that the treatment of the Palestinians in the occupied territories is terrible. But it's very different than apartheid. As the guy who was responsible for the drafting of the South African Anti-Apartheid Act, we in the United States came to this late in the game. The rest of the world had sanctions. The rest of the world was in position doing things against South Africa. We came to this late, and when we came to it, we made a difference. The problem is with the Palestinians, as awful as their treatment is, you do not even have a consensus in the Arab world on how to act. You do not have a world consensus. So to expect the United States to get out in front against our close friend is not going to happen.
With regard to this word and the occupied territories, it's a little bit, and I mean, Ambassador Katouf was mentioned Jimmy Carter in his book before. It's a little bit, in public discourse in the United States, it's a little bit like the N-word. It depends more on who's using it, than what it actually means, and in this case, the accuracy of the question is not the issue. It's also a debate stopper. I never use it. not because I don't think analogies might be drawn, but because it forecloses conversation and it just polarizes everybody. So it's pointless. The point here is that this is exactly this problem, this demographic problem that creates an unresolvable contradiction between the Israeli political system and the population that lives under Israeli rule in what is, after all, has become the de facto Israeli state for practical purposes since 1967, isn't possible. You can't have the two together. They don't go together. You know? And that the Israeli state ultimately has a choice to make between living in peace with a Palestinian state or trying to find some way to absorb an equal and soon to be greater number of Palestinian Muslims and Christians into its own polity or not. It really can't be. So there is that kind of choice, right? And ultimately, there's a question about whether you can have anything meaningful to be described as Israel or a Jewish state in which half or more than half of the people are not Jewish at all, whether they're enfranchised or not, whether they have political rights or not. How meaningful is that? You know, is that to call that Israel or to call it a Jewish state? So, in other words, all of this, and then that leaves aside the question of whether that can be stable and viable as a political order, and whether you're not inscribing resistance and possibly violent resistance into the mix as if there's no process to resolve it in a meaningful way. All of this means exactly why it's in Israel's interest to have two states, why it's in Israel's interest to have an end of conflict agreement, and exactly why the Palestinian interests, the Israeli interests, the American interests are all actually lined up. Whether the politics has facilitated the implementation of that or not, I do think that's the case. And the more we shift our understanding, our rhetoric, our analysis to recognize that, the further we get away from the zero-sum formulations of the past, the better off we'll be. But I think what's needed there, because it's in Israel's interest to have this, as well as the Palestinians and the Americans and what have you, is not to overthrow the special relationship, which I agree fully is not plausible in the foreseeable future and possibly is actually a meaningless enterprise in many ways, but rather to get the pro-Israel lobby in the United States, the mainstream Jewish community in the United States, and Friends of Israel in the United States to recognize that this is in Israel's interest. It isn't a matter of the United States bullying Israel into making concessions that are not in Israel's interests. On the contrary, it is a matter of the United States helping the Israelis and the Palestinians get to where they both need to go in their own interest, not as a favor to us, not as altruism to each other, not out of some kind of enlightened Gandhian epiphany of love and charity and what have you. No, in their own narrowly defined, narrowly drawn national interest, because the alternative takes us right down the road of the A word and conflict and what have you. And as I was trying to say before, there isn't any such thing as conflict management in this case, or stability. It just gets worse and worse and worse, and I don't think it's going to stabilize.
I want to thank the panelists for their original and fascinating insights, and thank all of you for your patience. Thank you very much for coming.